Just a floor nurse. That's what Dr. Ashford called her when he thought she couldn't hear. Just a floor nurse who didn't belong anywhere near critical decisions. They didn't know she'd performed 17 consecutive trauma surgeries in Ramadi while bleeding from shrapnel wounds. They had no idea the quiet woman adjusting the ventilator settings had once commanded a field hospital under direct mortar fire. The truth was walking through Seattle General's ICU at 11:06 p.m. on a Tuesday, checking vitals on the unconscious Air Force colonel in room 7, and nobody in the hospital understood what they were standing next to. What happened next would change everything. Ashley Cooper moved through the night shift with the kind of invisible competence that goes unnoticed until someone's dying. Her navy blue scrubs hung loose on her frame, practical and unremarkable, hiding the faint limp that came from shrapnel still lodged near her spine, a permanent souvenir from 2021 that refused to leave. The ICU hummed with its endless mechanical song, ventilators wheeling their oxygen-rich breaths, heart monitors beeping their steady confirmation that bodies were still holding on, for pumps clicking through medications that meant the difference between living and not. She moved between machines and beds with practiced grace, her hands steady as surgical lasers as she checked the colonel's endotracheal tube for proper placement, noting the slight deviation she'd seen 100 times before. The antiseptic smell of the hospital floor mingled with something metallic, the scent of fear that families left behind when they went home to sleep without knowing if their loved ones would wake up. The colonel lay motionless, sedated, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the machine breathing for him. She didn't recognize him at first. Not until she read the chart. Colonel Marcus Webb, 58, admitted 12 hours ago with acute respiratory distress. Transferred from Ramadi Joint Operations Command 3 years prior. The name didn't trigger anything until her eyes found the service record attached to the clipboard. Ramadi. August 2021. That was when her world ended and became something else entirely. Her hand paused on the ventilator dial. For exactly 3 seconds, she didn't move. The monitor beeped once. Twice. Normal rhythm. Normal oxygen saturation at 94%. Normal everything except the fact that the man lying unconscious in front of her had signed the order that destroyed her military career. Court-martial proceedings. Charges of insubordination. Dishonorable discharge from a woman who had just finished saving his entire unit from a field hospital bombing. She reached beneath her scrubs without thinking. The dog tag was there. It always was. A single tag on a broken chain, tarnished silver worn down to grey by 3 years of constant touching. The only piece of Ramadi she allowed herself to keep. The only physical proof that Major Ashley Cooper had existed before she became just another hospital nurse pushing for lines and documenting vital signs. Her fingers closed around the metal. It was cold. It was real. She adjusted the ventilator settings with clinical precision, increasing the PEEP to 12 centimeters of water, checking the tracheal cuff pressure to ensure proper seal, assessing his breath sounds with the kind of attention that most people reserved for things they actually cared about. But Ashley cared about everyone. That was the problem. That was why she was here instead of wherever colonels who'd made it to full retirement lived. The door opened at 12:23 a.m. Dr. James Ashford swept in with the kind of entrance that required no announcement because the entire room felt him arriving. He was tall in the way expensive suits made men look taller, his grey hair perfectly maintained, his face carved from the kind of confidence that came from 30 years of never being questioned. Behind him came a nurse, Sarah, who worked the cardiac floor, and behind her, the colonel's wife and daughter, their eyes red-rimmed and desperate. Dr. Ashford didn't acknowledge them immediately. He moved straight to the bedside and began examining the colonel with the casual authority of a man who'd never been told no by a machine or a human being. Ashley stepped back. One measured breath. That was her instinct now. Make yourself smaller. Make yourself invisible. Don't remind the people with power that you exist unless they specifically request your presence. The dog tag pressed against her collarbone. Dr. Ashford's eyes swept across the monitor readings. Then they landed on Ashley. Who adjusted his ventilator settings? His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, low, powerful, capable of crushing things without trying. I did. She kept her voice level. 30 minutes ago. O2 sat was drifting, so I increased. I didn't ask for a suggestion, Nurse Cooper. He didn't look at her. He was already reaching for the ventilator dial. These settings are too aggressive. You're pushing air into his lungs that his cardiac status can't support. The colonel's wife stepped forward. She was thin, hollow-eyed, holding a coffee cup like it was the only real thing in the room. Is something wrong? Has something changed? Your husband's lungs are damaged, but his heart is compromised. Dr. Ashford didn't turn to face her either. He made a show of adjusting the PEEP back down to 8 centimeters. Floor nurses sometimes miss the complexity of dual system failure. They see one problem and push interventions without understanding cascade effects. Ashley's jaw tightened. Just a half millimeter. Invisible to anyone not trained to look for it. The settings were appropriate for his current blood gas panel, Ashley said. Her voice hadn't changed. It was still soft, still deferential, still the voice of someone who knew her place. His PCO2 was rising and his pH was trending toward respiratory acidosis. Dr. Ashford turned to face her for the first time, and his expression shifted into something that looked like pity mixed with contempt. Let me be crystal clear so there's no further confusion about scope of practice. You are a floor nurse. Your job is to document vitals and notify me if parameters change. Your job is not to make clinical decisions that override my assessment. He gestured toward the door with his hand, the kind of gesture that made people want to leave rooms. In fact, why don't you give Sarah the primary care assignment for this patient? I'd prefer someone without the habit of overstepping. The colonel's daughter, she couldn't have been more than 30, looked between Ashley and Dr. Ashford with confusion blooming across her face. She'd heard someone challenge her father's doctor. She'd heard it happen. And she'd watched the person doing the challenging be dismissed like they were disposable. Ashley nodded once. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't say that she'd spent 8 years earning a degree in emergency medicine before joining the army, that she'd trained under surgeons whose names appeared in medical journals, that her hands had held more trauma cases than Dr. Ashford had probably seen in his careful, privileged career. Instead, she turned and walked out of room 7 with the exact same pace as before, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just been publicly humiliated in front of a patient's family. She made it to the break room at 12:31 a.m. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects trapped in plastic. She set her coffee mug on the table, the one that said Seattle General Cardiac Unit in fading blue lettering, and sat down. Her hands were steady. That was the thing about training in field medicine under mortar fire. Your hands learned to stay steady no matter what. Fear became information. Anger became data. Humiliation became just another environmental factor you had to work around. The other nurses came in at 12:34 a.m. Sarah, Michelle, and Jennifer, the night shift crew that had become something like family in the way hospital teams did, especially on the cardiac floors where people died with regularity enough to build a kind of dark camaraderie. They saw her sitting alone. They saw the coffee mug. They saw the expression on her face that said absolutely nothing because she'd learned to erase herself down to the bare minimum required for survival. And wordlessly, without a single exchange of glances, they grabbed their lunch containers and relocated to the hallway. Jennifer hesitated for half a second, her hand on the break room door, but then Sarah touched her shoulder and they left. The door closed. Ashley sat alone with her coffee. At 12:37 a.m., Dr. Ashford walked past the break room and smirked through the small window in the door. He saw her sitting there, isolated, exactly where someone who'd overstepped belonged. He saw isolation as punishment. He saw it as victory. He didn't see that her silence was a choice. He didn't see that some people became more dangerous when they stopped talking. He was still smirking when Ashley reached up and touched the dog tag beneath her scrubs. She drew one measured breath. The kind of breath that came before decisions that couldn't be unmade. Then she looked directly at the window, and without raising her voice enough to carry into the hallway, she said the words that made his smirk disappear. I've survived worse than you, doctor. Something in her voice sounded like a promise. Not a threat. Worse than a threat. A promise made by someone who'd already survived things that would have broken most people into pieces small enough to sweep into a corner. Dr. Ashford's expression flickered, just for a moment, just enough that Ashley saw it. He didn't understand what he was challenging. He didn't comprehend that he was standing in front of someone who'd already been court-martialed once, who'd already lost everything once, who had absolutely nothing left to protect because she'd learned to become a person who could function without any of it. He'd been building his power structure for 30 years through board connections and carefully curated performance reviews, through strategic friendships with hospital administrators and patients with money enough to influence institutional decisions. She'd built herself from the ground up on the only thing that couldn't be taken away, the ability to help people stay alive. He walked away from the break room window without another word, and Ashley sat alone with her coffee while the machines in the ICU hummed their mechanical song 40 feet away, keeping the man who'd destroyed her alive through the night shift, while she waited for whatever came next, knowing that something was coming, the way you always know when you're standing on the edge of a precipice that nobody else has spotted yet. The parking garage smelled like diesel and wet concrete. Ashley sat in her Civic with the engine off, her forehead pressed against the steering wheel, hands trembling against her thighs, not from fear, but from the restraint it took not to move. 3 hours ago, Dr. Ashford had reassigned her supporting staff. Just like that. The 3 nurses who'd been cross-trained to anticipate her movements, who understood when she needed a central line kit before she asked, who knew that she worked best when surrounded by people who didn't require explanations, gone. Reassigned to other units. Other shifts. A clean surgical strike of institutional isolation. She lifted her head and stared at the concrete pillar in front of her. Rain drummed on the windshield like someone demanding entry. Her phone sat on the passenger seat, dark and silent. She deleted the nursing group chat at 2:48 p.m. after watching 6 nurses respond to Ashford's schedule change with thumbs-up emojis. 6 people she'd covered for, stayed late for, mentored through their own crises. Gone. The air inside the car felt thin. Ashley pulled her scrub top away from her body and touched the dog tag beneath the fabric, metal cold against her fingertips, worn smooth by 3 years of hands finding it in moments like this. St. Christopher on one side. Blank on the reverse. She'd filed off her name, rank, and service number with a steel wool pad in her apartment bathroom on the day she decided to disappear. Major Ashley Cooper ceased to exist on that day. What remained was a floor nurse who changed bedpans and followed orders. What remained could not help people. She breathed in through her nose. For counts. Held it. For counts. Released. This was tactical breathing. She'd taught this to combat medics in Ramadi while 155mm artillery made the ground vibrate like a living thing. Panic kills faster than shrapnel. Control your physiology. Control the outcome. By 5:15 p.m. she was back on the unit, and the real work began. Ashford had altered the master schedule that morning, a document that seemed minor until you understood its architecture. He'd staggered her breaks, assigned her to the opposite end of the ICU from the colonel's room, and buried her between 2 senior nurses who'd been in the hospital for 18 years and understood the unspoken rule, don't associate with the problem. The message was written in scheduling blocks and time slots. It was professional. Strategic. It was the work of someone who'd weaponized institutional protocol the way snipers weaponize bullet drop tables. By 6:02 p.m., Ashley was charting in a corner cubicle when Ashford walked past with a stack of papers. He didn't acknowledge her. He walked to the unit board, the physical space where critical information lived, where every nurse and resident and student on the floor saw announcements, policy updates, performance reviews. He pinned a single sheet of paper with a thumbtack that penetrated the cork with unnecessary force. The sound of it carried across the ICU like a gunshot in a vault. Ashley watched 5 nurses and 3 residents read it. She watched their eyes move down the page. She watched them look at her. She watched them look away. The formal written reprimand was written in Ashford's architectural handwriting, each letter deliberately large. Ashley Cooper, insubordination and failure to respect chain of command. Multiple violations of treatment protocol authorization. Further infractions will result in immediate disciplinary action up to and including termination. The date was today's date. The timestamp was for 4:44 p.m. She remained in her cubicle. She did not walk to the board. She did not read the full text. She already knew what he'd written because she understood his tactical doctrine now. This wasn't about the ventilator settings or her suggestions about imaging. This was about creating visible consequences. This was about making her isolation public enough that no one would risk association. Ashford walked back down the hallway 14 minutes later. He made eye contact with her through the cubicle opening. He smiled. Not a smile of warmth or humor, a smile like a predator documenting a successful trap. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, then moved on. Ashley did not flinch. Did not blink. Did not allow her expression to change. The trembling she felt was not fear. The trembling was restraint. 3 years of military training, 2 tours of tactical operations, 1 active court-martial and dismissal, all of it compressed into her chest cavity like a fist made of scar tissue. She went back to charting. At 6:13 p.m., Ashford found her at the nurses' station where the unit census board displayed real-time vitals for all 14 ICU patients. He approached like a man who'd decided something important. For residents were nearby, reviewing a chart. He addressed her with the velocity of someone who'd calculated exactly how many witnesses he needed. "Cooper, I'm curious about something." His voice carried the texture of casual conversation, the kind of tone that made cruelty feel like mentoring. "How long have you been nursing?" She didn't look up from the board. 11 years, doctor." 11 years. "And in those 11 years, have you ever completed formal education in critical care diagnostics?" "I completed a critical care nursing certification in 2019. "A certification?" "Right. Not a medical degree. Not a residency. A certification." He paused. The residents had stopped pretending to read. "I ask because you've questioned my treatment decision 17 times this month." 17. "Do you know what that number means, Cooper?" It means you have a problem with authority. It means you think your weekend continuing education makes you qualified to contradict physicians with board certifications from Johns Hopkins and Duke. It means you're a problem." He stepped closer. His cologne smelled expensive, the kind of scent that costs money specifically because it announces cost. "I've built a reputation here for excellence. I have 3 board certifications. I've published. I have fellows who call me for guidance. And you're the nurse who can't follow a protocol." She kept her eyes on the board. The colonel's vitals glowed in their electronic cells. O2 saturation 96%. Respiratory rate 16. Blood pressure 128/72. Stable. "For now. I follow evidence," she said quietly. "Evidence." He laughed, a real sound, not performed. "You think you're following evidence. What you're actually following is your own ego. You think you know better. You think the physicians here are wrong. And that's a problem I can't tolerate." He stepped back. "You're flagged, Cooper. 1 more incident of insubordination, and I'll have a conversation with HR about whether this position is still viable for you. Clear?" "Clear, doctor." He left. The residents returned to their chart, but nothing had changed in the ICU except the architecture of fear. Everyone on that floor understood what had just happened. Everyone understood that Ashford had institutional authority and that he could use it like a blade. And everyone understood that Ashley had no one to call. She touched the dog tag beneath her scrubs. 1 measured breath. She was a major. She had commanded 47 combat medics across 3 forward operating bases. She had led casualty evacuation operations while mortars fell around her with the precision of something that wanted her specifically dead. She had trained soldiers how to stop bleeding from wounds no training should ever prepare you for. She had held people who were falling apart, literally, their bodies failing system by system, and she had given them the gift of a calm voice telling them they weren't alone. And she had obeyed a colonel's order to evacuate when she knew the evacuation would kill people she was treating. She had been court-martialed for the people she saved by refusing to obey him. Now she was a floor nurse in Raleigh, North Carolina, watching a surgeon weaponize bureaucracy against her because she'd been competent. The irony tasted like copper. At 7:04 p.m., Ashley approached the colonel's room one final time before shift change. Her relief was arriving at 7:30. She would leave. She would drive home through rain that hadn't stopped all day, and she would sit in an apartment that felt like a bunker, and she would try to sleep while knowing that a man upstairs was deteriorating and that tomorrow the imaging might reveal nothing because nothing would be there to find if he didn't make it to morning. She pulled up his chart on the bedside monitor. The numbers told a story, and the story was written in trending lines. O2 saturation, 96% at 3 a.m. when she'd left shift. 94% at 11 a.m. when she'd returned. 92% at 4 p.m. Now at 7:04 p.m., 89%. Still technically acceptable. Still in the range where a casual observer wouldn't worry. But she'd held enough dying people to recognize the pattern. The lungs don't fail all at once. They fail like a dam with a hairline fracture, small, then smaller, then everything. Respiratory rate, 16 at 3 a.m. 18 at 11 a.m. 20 at 4 p.m. 24 now. His body was working harder to push air through whatever was collecting in his chest cavity. Compensation. The body's last argument before it surrenders. The colonel lay sedated and on mechanical ventilation, his wife asleep in the chair beside him, their teenage daughter somewhere in the waiting room with a textbook she wasn't reading. He didn't know that the person who'd saved his life was the same person he'd destroyed. He didn't know that every decision she made about his care was shadowed by the court-martial, the dismissal, the 3 years of walking into rooms where people respected the credentials on the name tag rather than the competence in the hands. Ashley placed her fingers on his wrist anyway. Found his pulse. Felt it working against her skin, fast, pushing blood through a body that was running out of time. The rain hammered the windows. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. In the ceiling above, fluorescent lights hummed with the frequency of electricity pushing against physics. And somewhere down the hallway, Dr. Ashford was finishing his charting, planning his evening, completely unaware that the decision he'd made, the wait until morning, had become a countdown. She didn't know it yet, but that decision had just started a clock that would end careers. The monitor alarm shrieked at 2:07 a.m. Ashley's eyes snapped open from the chart she'd been reviewing at the nurse's station. 1 second of sound. 2. The pitch climbing like a siren that wouldn't stop. She was moving before her brain caught up, muscle memory pulling her toward the colonel's room while the rest of the ICU pretended not to notice, the way they always did when she moved now, as if proximity to her was contagious. The colonel's oxygen saturation read 74%. Falling. His heart rate, 148 and climbing. His lips had taken on a blue-gray cast that hadn't been there 90 minutes ago when she'd last checked on him during rounds, back when she still had access, back when Ashford hadn't reprogrammed her badge to lock her out of the room after the break room incident. She'd sat in her car for 3 hours during her break. Engine dead. Head on the steering wheel. The parking garage fluorescent lights flickering overhead like a broken metronome, counting the minutes until she did something catastrophic or drove home and never came back. Her phone had buzzed twice. The charge nurse asking where she was. A reminder about her 2 a.m. vitals check on room for 12. She hadn't moved until the third buzz, the oxygen saturation alert, climbing into her consciousness like a siren in the dark. 78%. Then 76. Then lower. She'd run. Now she was running again, but this time Ashford was waiting, leaning against the doorframe of room for 12 like he owned the patient, the room, the entire ICU, his presence like a man standing in a doorway during a fire and calling it control. "I told you to stay away from this patient, Cooper." His voice came out smooth. Clinical. The kind of authority that wore a white coat like armor and had spent decades sharpening itself against complaints that never quite landed, board members who owed him favors, and a hospital system that valued his reputation more than the pulse beneath his decisions. Ashley's jaw tightened. Just a fraction. Enough to feel it, not enough to show it. She'd learned that discipline in Ramadi, learned it when an RPG had blown through the medical tent, and she'd kept working anyway, not flinching, not freezing, not allowing her hands to tremble even as her own blood ran down her arm and pulled on the surgical drape. "His SAT is 74%, doctor." "I'm aware of the oxygen saturation, Nurse Cooper." The pause before her title was a knife. She kept her voice flat. "Clinical. Plummeting Saturday. Heart rate 148. Accessory muscle use. Tracheal deviation to the left. Tracheal deviation." The words hung in the space between them like a name she wasn't supposed to know. Like a sign pointing to what Ashford's imaging had missed. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the chest cavity collapsing one lung, compressing the heart, building pressure with every breath the ventilator pushed into his lungs. Every artificial breath was worse than the last. A bomb built in increments. A countdown disguised as standard care. "The thoracic team will be here at 6 a.m., Ashford said. "We wait. That's the protocol. The protocol doesn't account for acute decompensation. And you're suddenly reading the protocols now." His eyes narrowed. "Dangerous. You questioned my clinical judgment to patients' families. You performed unauthorized procedures. You inserted yourself into critical care decisions that are not your scope. You don't have the board certification, the training, or the authority to question my assessment." Every word landed like a scalpel, calculated to remind her of exactly what she wasn't allowed to be anymore. Nurse. That was her scope. Nurses took orders. Nurses didn't think. Nurses didn't remember how to read a patient's body like a story written in vital signs and breath patterns and the subtle shift of a trachea moving the wrong direction. The colonel's wife was visible through the window in the adjoining waiting area. His daughter slept against her shoulder, chin tilted at an angle that would hurt her neck in the morning. They'd been there since 6 p.m. yesterday. Waiting. Trusting that the man in the white coat had everything under control. Ashley's hand moved toward her chest, toward the dog tag under her scrubs, the one piece of Ramadi she'd allowed herself to keep. The chain was broken. It had been broken since she'd cut it off with trauma shears in a parking lot 3 years ago, trying to leave that version of herself behind. But she kept the tag anyway. Wore it against her heart like penance, like evidence, like a ghost that wouldn't stay buried. Ashford saw the movement. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of satisfaction. She was rattled. She was scared. She was exactly what he'd been working to prove, a nurse who'd stepped out of her lane and was now being brought back into it. "Step away from the patient, Cooper." That's an order. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The kind of institutional authority that had destroyed her career once already, that had military doctors agreeing with other military doctors that a major who saved 43 lives in a single 17-hour span had insubordinate her way out of command. The monitor showed another drop. 71% now. The heart rate holding steady at 150. The colonel's breathing labored against the ventilator, fighting the machine like a man drowning in air. She didn't step away. Instead, she moved toward the supply cart with her eyes straight ahead, her movements precise and economical, the way a person moves when they've made a decision that can't be unmade. Ashford didn't move to stop her. Maybe he thought he'd already won. Maybe he thought the chain of command was still a chain, still unbroken, still held him at the top of a hierarchy that mattered. She was already reaching for the 14-gauge angiocath needle, her hand steady as surgical lasers, muscle memory flooding back like muscle memory had only ever been asleep, never actually dead. "What are you doing?" Ashford's voice had changed. Lost its smoothness. "Cooper, I am explicitly ordering you." She didn't answer. She'd heard orders before. She'd followed orders before. She'd also watched people die while she followed orders, and she'd decided 3 years ago in a parking lot that she would never do that again, no matter what the cost. She swabbed the Colonel's second intercostal space with alcohol, the cold sting of it sharp against her focus. Midclavicular line. The location carved into her muscle memory from a field hospital in Ramadi where she'd done this exact procedure on a 19-year-old Lance Corporal while sand was blowing through the tent and incoming fire was systematic enough that you could set a watch by it. "You're finished," Ashford said. "Your badge is deactivated as of right now. Security is on the way. You perform that procedure and you're not just fired, you're destroyed." The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. The sudden release of pressure. The monitor showing oxygen saturation beginning to climb, 73, 75, 77, climbing. The Colonel's breathing suddenly easier against the ventilator. His color beginning to normalize. His heart rate dropping toward the 120s. The man breathing now instead of suffocating. Everything Ashford said happened next came from very far away. The shouting. The footsteps. The security guard with his hand on his belt like he was prepared to physically remove her from a patient she'd just saved from dying in increments while the morning surgeon slept. She was already moving toward the door, already stepping back, already knowing exactly how many minutes she had left before the badge deactivation took hold and her access codes locked her out of every system in this building. The dog tag cut into her palm where she'd made a fist, and she didn't let go of it. "I need some Jell-O," she said quietly, to no one in particular, as they escorted her out of the ICU. "And my box." The needle decompression released air like a sigh, a hiss that filled the ICU room, but Colonel Harrison's oxygen saturation refused to climb past 68. Ashley knew what that meant. The pneumothorax was bilateral. One needle wouldn't save him. "Get me a scalpel," Ashley said. Her voice was level. Measured. The voice of someone who had made this decision before, in a field hospital in Ramadi with mortars shaking the walls and blood on her face. Dr. Ashford erupted from the corner where he'd been watching, his face turning the color of a beet left in the sun too long. "Absolutely not. Step back from that patient immediately. His saturation is 68 and dropping. He needs a thoracotomy or he dies in the next 4 minutes. I said step back." Ashford's voice cracked like he was screaming through a broken speaker. He turned to the staff gathered at the monitor station. "Nobody gives her anything. I'm calling security. Now." Ashley didn't acknowledge him. She reached into her bag, the leather messenger bag she'd carried since Ramadi, and withdrew the combat knife her unit had engraved with her call sign, Angel 6. The blade caught the fluorescent light as she prepped the second intercostal space, her fingers finding the landmarks with the precision of a GPS system locked on coordinates. Ribs. Intercostal space. Mid-axillary line. Her hands moved on their own because some knowledge lives deeper than thought, deeper than institutional rules or the trembling voice of an administrator who'd never seen what she'd seen. "Security!" Ashford was screaming into his phone. "ICU. Now!" The Colonel's wife gripped the chair. The machines beeped their frantic rhythm. Ashley made the incision, one smooth motion, muscle memory from 14 years of field surgery, and the chest tube followed, placed with the same fluid precision she'd used to save the lives of 247 soldiers in 2019, though nobody in this room knew that except the man on the table who couldn't remember her face. Oxygen saturation began climbing. 72, 78, 85. Security arrived in 37 seconds. 2 men, both built like they worked cargo shifts at the port, both looking deeply uncomfortable about what they'd been asked to do. One of them wouldn't meet Ashley's eyes. She recognized that look. Respect with a side of confusion. "You need to come with us," the taller one said. Not a request. It was the tone security always used, the same tone soldiers used when they were following orders they didn't believe in. Ashley stepped back from the bed, her hand still covered in the colonel's blood. Her badge hung around her neck on a lanyard, right next to the dog tag on its broken chain, the only piece of her past she allowed herself to keep. One of the security guards reached for her badge. She didn't resist. Dr. Ashford was already on his phone again, pacing the hallway like a predator who'd tasted blood and wanted more. His voice was different now. Calculated. Yes, this is Dr. Pierce Ashford, Chief of Surgery at Seattle General. I need to speak with someone on the hospital board. Immediately. We have a critical situation. A pause. Then, a nurse performed an authorized surgery. A field thoracotomy. Without my authorization. Without proper credentials. Yes, I understand the liability implications. Yes, she's an employee. No, I don't think she should be. She's a danger to this institution. Ashley heard him making the calls as security escorted her down the corridor. One call after another, his voice smooth and professional as he painted her as a dangerous liability. Each phone call was a small calculated move, not the meltdown of a desperate man, but the strategic demolition of a threat by someone who understood the architecture of institutional power. Ashford had allies. Board members who owed him favors. Lawyers on speed dial. He was building his narrative before anyone could build hers. By the time they reached the security office on the first floor, her badge had already been flagged in the system. Deactivated. Gone. The security guards processed her like she was a criminal, asked her to turn in her access card, her parking pass, anything hospital property. She handed them over without speaking. The taller guard, the one who wouldn't meet her eyes, looked like he wanted to say something. He didn't. HR called her at 5:24 a.m. Not a conversation. A termination. The director's voice was professional and distant, the tone of someone reading from a script written by lawyers. Your employment with Seattle General is terminated effective immediately. You performed a medical procedure without authorization from the attending physician. This constitutes gross insubordination and violation of hospital protocol. Your badge has been deactivated. You are no longer permitted on hospital property. We will mail your final paycheck within 10 business days. Ashley sat in her 2015 Honda Civic in the parking garage, the same spot where she'd sat for hours earlier with the engine dead and her head on the steering wheel, unable to move because she'd let a man like Ashford make her invisible. Now she had a cardboard box of belongings on her passenger seat. Scrubs. A photo from her son's high school graduation. The surgery handbook she'd carried for 18 years. Her stethoscope with its weight like a talisman in the box. The car was quiet except for the sound of rain beginning to hammer the concrete roof above her. Steady. Relentless. Like enemy fire, she thought, and then stopped herself because she wasn't supposed to think in those terms anymore. That life was over. Ramadi was over. The commendations were over. All of it was over, twice now. Her phone buzzed. A text from the charge nurse, the only nurse who'd stayed kind to her through all of this. The colonel is stable. He's asking who saved his life. Who do I tell him? Ashley stared at the words for 34 seconds. The rain intensified, pounding the parking garage like applause, like shrapnel hitting metal, like everything she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. She didn't respond to the text. She started the car and pulled out of Seattle General's parking garage, watching the hospital disappear in her rearview mirror, a structure built to save lives receding into the dark. She had been fired twice now. Once by the Air Force for disobeying orders that would have cost lives. Once by a hospital for saving a life. The mathematics of it, the cruel irony of being punished for exactly what she was built to do, sat heavy in her chest. The box of belongings rattled as she turned left onto Elm Street, heading toward her apartment, toward nowhere, toward the kind of empty that comes when you've burned every bridge you built. She was 41 years old. She was unemployed. She was driving away from the one place where she'd tried to become someone new. The rain kept falling. But what Ashley didn't know What nobody in that hospital except the colonel on the ventilator could confirm was that the procedure she performed had bought him 36 more hours of life. In those hours, his lungs would begin to heal. The alveoli would expand. His body would remember how to breathe. And in the morning, a Navy veteran on the hospital's IT team would review the security footage that Dr. Ashford had already tried to delete, and he would see exactly what Ashley had done. Not recklessness. Textbook. The kind of procedure taught in field medicine training, performed with the precision of someone who'd done it not once but multiple times under conditions that would have broken most people into smaller pieces. The colonel would wake to find his daughter crying. His wife holding his hand. And the first question out of his mouth, before he asked about his prognosis, before he asked about his recovery, would be the only question that mattered: who saved my life? Her son Derek stood in her apartment doorway, breathless, holding the shadow box she'd buried in the basement 3 years ago. The one she'd promised herself she'd never open again. "Mom, they need to see these," he said, and before Ashley could move, before she could reach for the box and seal it back into darkness where it belonged, Derek was already driving them back to Seattle General. Back to the place that had just fired her. Back to the conference room where the hospital board had convened an emergency meeting about Dr. Ashford's complaint, the one painting her as a reckless liability who'd performed unauthorized procedures and endangered a patient's life. The fluorescent lights of the hallway flickered like stuttering heartbeats as Derek walked into that conference room without knocking. 17-year-old Derek in his school hoodie, holding a shadow box that weighed more than its wooden frame should allow. "You fired Major Ashley Cooper," he said. His voice didn't waver. Bronze Star recipient. Purple Heart recipient. She saved over 40 lives in Ramadi. You need to know who she is before you decide what she did. The room went dead silent. A trembling nurse sat at the conference table, someone Ashley recognized from the ICU floor, a woman named Martinez who'd gone pale when Ashley was escorted out the night before. But there was something different about her now. Recognition. Understanding. Her hand shook as she reached for Ashley's file, as she began reading aloud from the commendations that Ashley had never displayed, never mentioned, never used to justify herself. Commendation for Valor under fire, Martinez read, her voice cracking. Treated 18 casualties simultaneously during a mortar attack on the field hospital in Fallujah, Jolan district. Performed surgery in a dust storm with no anesthesia except morphine she rationed between patients. Martinez looked up, tears streaking her face. I was a corpsman. I know what that means. That means she was working on combat wounds that most surgeons would refuse without a full surgical team. That means she was saving lives that were already written off as lost. The colonel appeared next. Not the unconscious man from the ICU. This was Colonel William Harrison in his wheelchair, oxygen cannula running beneath his nose, dressed in his service dress uniform like he'd known he was coming to a battle. His voice sounded like gravel underwater, rough, damaged, but still carrying the weight of command. I court-martialed Major Cooper in Ramadi 3 years ago, he said, and Ashley felt the room hold its breath. I ordered her to evacuate the field hospital when we came under sustained attack. She refused. She kept operating. Kept saving soldiers who had no other hope. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice fractured like old ice. The hospital took a direct hit 15 minutes after she refused to leave. The blast killed 2 orderlies and a surgeon. Major Cooper was buried under rubble for 8 minutes. Shrapnel embedded in her left shoulder, right hip, and her left hand. He held up the file that Martinez had been reading. While she was bleeding from those wounds, she performed 17 consecutive trauma surgeries. 17. Soldiers who'd been written off. Soldiers whose families would have gotten notification papers instead of homecoming reunions. She earned the Distinguished Service Medal for that night. I recommended her for court-martial instead of understanding that she'd just taught me what true leadership looks like. The hospital's IT director stood up, a man Ashley recognized from the break room, someone who always wore Navy veteran bracelets on his wrist. His name was Mitchell, and he looked directly at Dr. Ashford. I also found something you should see, Mitchell said, and his voice had the precision of someone who'd interrogated people who didn't want to answer. You tried to delete the security footage from the Colonel's ICU room last night. You thought you were careful. You weren't. He tapped a tablet, and the conference room screen flickered to life. The footage showed everything. The Colonel's oxygen saturation dropping. Ashley at the bedside, reading the signs, recognizing the tension pneumothorax that the imaging had missed. Dr. Ashford arriving, assessing, then ordering her away with words that crackled through the speakers like a whip. And then, the moment the audience had been waiting for, Ashley's steady hands. The 14-gauge needle at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The hiss of air escaping. Oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 75 to 82 to 88. Sinus rhythm. Stability. According to protocol and the American Heart Association's emergency medicine guidelines, Mitchell said, Major Cooper's intervention was textbook. Correct anatomical location. Correct timing. Correct needle gauge. The State Medical Board watched this footage 2 hours ago. Dr. Ashford's delay in care would have resulted in the patient's death within 4 minutes. This board now has that assessment in writing. The hospital's board chair stood. Her name was Diane Worthington, and she'd been sitting in silence for the entire revelation, her face hardening with each piece of evidence. Dr. Ashford, your employment is terminated effective immediately. You will surrender your credential badge to security. The State Medical Board has opened a formal investigation into your practice. We are also notifying the FBI. The FBI. Because Mitchell had more. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigation expanded like an infection spreading through compromised tissue. The State Medical Board found 4 cases where Ashford's delays in treatment had led to preventable complications, all covered up through his board connections. Residents came forward with stories of intimidation, of being ordered to falsify patient charts, of having their evaluations destroyed if they questioned his protocols. 2 of those residents were former military medics, the same medics Ashley had been befriending, the same ones Dr. Ashford had systematically isolated and eventually driven out. The hospital settled with the 3 former nurses for undisclosed amounts. Ashford's medical license was suspended, then permanently revoked. His board positions dissolved overnight. The institutional authority he'd spent 32 years cultivating crumbled because it had never been built on competence. It had been built on fear. On the silence of people who were too afraid to speak. On the erasure of people who did. 6 months later, a private investigator hired by Ashford's ex-wife photographed him selling insurance from a folding table in a strip mall off Highway 401. His hair had grayed overnight, or so it seemed. His suit was wrong, cheap polyester instead of the Italian wool he'd favored. He was cold-calling strangers about term life policies, his name now a cautionary tale in medical ethics seminars across North Carolina. The man who'd wielded institutional power like a surgical instrument, cutting and cauterizing, was reduced to sitting alone in a fluorescent-lit hallway outside a tax preparation office, waiting for people who didn't want to talk to him. But that wasn't the end point of the story. It was just the collateral damage. Ashley Cooper stood in her new office, Director of Emergency Medicine, Seattle General, Raleigh, overlooking the same parking garage where she'd once sat paralyzed in her car. The shadow box hung on her wall now, no longer hidden. Her bronze star and purple heart visible in the light. Her son Derek was in college on a scholarship funded by the hospital settlement with the 3 nurses who'd come before her. Her dog tag, the one on the broken chain, hung beneath her white coat. Not hidden. Not erased. Just there. Colonel William Harrison visited on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd regained most of his function. The oxygen was gone. The wheelchair had been replaced by a cane that he barely needed anymore. His wife and daughter were with him. He wore his service dress uniform, every ribbon in perfect alignment. When he stepped into Ashley's office, he rendered a salute, formal, precise, deliberate. The salute he should have given 3 years ago in Ramadi. Major Cooper, he said, I owe you 2 apologies. One for Ramadi. One for not recognizing you in that ICU. Ashley returned the salute, feeling the weight of the dog tag beneath her coat, feeling the muscle memory of authority that she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. You were following regulations, Colonel. I was following my conscience. Both matter. But conscience should never cost someone their life. They talked for an hour. About Ramadi. About the 17 soldiers she'd saved. About the system that punishes people for being right. About what happens when the hierarchy is wrong and you have to choose between obedience and honor. There was no easy answer, and they both knew it. That was why the conversation mattered. As the colonel left, his daughter hung back. She was maybe 20, military-bearing even in civilian clothes. You saved my dad twice, she said. Once in Iraq. Once here. Thank you for not giving up. When they were gone, Ashley walked through her emergency department, watching her staff treat patients with the competence that military service demands. 3 of her nurses were veterans. She'd hired them specifically. 2 were former medics. 1 was a former Air Force pararescueman. They worked together like a unit, like people who understood that hierarchy was a tool for saving lives, not a weapon for controlling them. She found a young nurse being berated by an attending physician and intervened. Dr. Morris, we discussed disagreements professionally. That nurse's observation was clinically sound. The young nurse looked up, shocked. Rescued. The same look Ashley had worn 3 years ago when someone finally understood that she wasn't just a nurse. She was a major. She was a person who'd already survived the worst that war could offer. She didn't need to survive institutional cruelty on top of it. Later that week, Ashley taught a seminar for new hires about speaking up. About the difference between hierarchy and wisdom. About why the quietest person in the room might be the one holding everyone together. She talked about Ramadi without mentioning Ramadi. She talked about the field hospital that took a direct hit and the people who refused to run. On her desk, next to her family photo, sat a framed quote she'd had made, "Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." The dog tag stayed around her neck, no longer hidden, no longer a reminder of what she'd lost, but of what she'd refused to become. Silent. Small. Erasable. She'd been ordered to stop treating the colonel. She'd refused. And in that refusal, in that choice to follow her conscience instead of her chain of command, she'd saved his life. But more than that, she'd saved something in herself. The part that knew her own worth. The part that refused to be just a nurse. The part that was Major Ashley Cooper, and that made all the difference. If you've ever had to choose between what's easy and what's right, between obedience and conscience, hit that subscribe button. Share your story in the comments. Because the real heroes are walking among us, and they deserve to be seen. Not just heard. Seen. Like and subscribe for more stories of people who refuse to be silent.